Hello and welcome to the 9th webinar for Sustainable Cities course. This week in the 8th module, we looked into understanding the SDGs, how they emerged and what they represent. We also looked into how sustainable development through SDGs can be financed, implemented, monitored, and measured. Today we will listen and interact with Chandrika. Chandrika Bahadur is the president of Sustainable Development Solutions Network Association, that is the SDSN Associations. Previously, she was the director of Education Initiative at the UN SDSN. Chandrika worked with United Nations in different roles. In her last assignment, she was a policy advisor at UNDP's Bureau for Development Policy in New York, working in Africa to help ministries of finance and planning align their strategies to the Millennium Development Goals across 20 different countries. She also has prior teaching experiences at Harvard and Columbia. Please feel free to write in your questions, thoughts, or comments in the chat box. Chandrika will now briefly give us a small talk of about 5 to 10 minutes, about 15 minutes, and then we will take your questions. Thank you. Over to you, Chandrika.
Thank you, Vinita. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. Welcome to this webinar. It's wonderful to be part of the Sustainable Cities course again. This topic that we have for this week is actually really at the heart of how to make the Sustainable Development Goals work. And let's take one step back in terms of where they've come from. I think you've heard a lot about the Sustainable Development Goals during the course of these last several weeks and the webinars that you've been attending. And I think, it's nice to, at some point, take a step back and think about where these 17 very, very different, very, very diverse goals really emanate from. They haven't come out of nowhere. They haven't come out of a vacuum. The goals are essentially an articulation of a process and priorities that have been many years in the making. So Vinita mentioned in her introduction the Millennium Development Goals. The Millennium Development Goals, as many of you would know, were designed in the year 2000. They were designed at and around the Millennium Summit, which was a meeting of the heads of state of the United Nations that took place in New York in the year 2000. And the Millennium Goals were probably the first time that world leaders at the United Nations had articulated a set of fairly diverse objectives that every country signed on to. And that was a first for the UN in terms of the scale and the breadth of what had been achieved at that summit. And what those goals essentially said was that the world is in a state of prosperity at this moment of time, where it is our articulation and our ambition that nobody should live in conditions that we do not consider as the basic minimum conditions for a decent and a dignified life. And that was the underpinning for the goals. And if you look at the Millennium Goals, they were focused around essentially ending situations of deprivation. So they focused on ending extreme poverty, they focused on ending hunger, on providing children with a basic education, on eliminating child mortality, maternal mortality, and infectious diseases. So essentially, these were all challenges that mostly low and middle income countries were facing. And they were challenges that all had technical solutions. So the thinking behind the Millennium Goals were that here are problems that are solvable, and that we as the global community have the resources to solve these problems. So we declare that we will, in the next 15 years, try and make sure that we make enormous headway in bringing people out of these conditions, or in a situation where they are not living in conditions that we consider are avoidable and can be solved. So those were the Millennium Goals. And what happened over the 15 years, from the year 2000 to the year 2015, when these goals were the guiding framework of the United Nations, was that slowly they gained traction, first at the international level, but then increasingly within countries. And the final aspect of the Millennium Goals, which is important for this context, is that these were goals that 7 of the 8 goals were essentially the responsibility of developing countries. But the 8th goal was the goal for partnership, which was that this was a pact that was created when the goals were adopted, that addressing these challenges would require resources, and those resources would be shared by developed and developing countries so that this would be seen as a joint global effort. And so what was the experience with those goals? What we found over those 15 years was, first, there was a fair amount of traction and a lot of progress was made on several of the goals. I wouldn't say that this was a 100% success story, because initiatives like this rarely are. But what it demonstrated was that there was a value to having a shared set of very simple, very relatable outcomes that made sense to you and me, to common people around the world, and that actually resonated across countries. And that was the premise of the goals. Maximum progress was made in health, poverty reduction, education in terms of enrollment. And so these were the areas where you could really see the impact of having these global goals and how they galvanized not just the international community, but multilateral organizations, national governments, bilateral aid partners, community organizations, civil society groups, and then eventually communities around the world. So that was, I would say, the big takeaway of success from the Millennium Goals. Now, the Sustainable Goals are a little bit different, and they're different in several ways. The first is they have a much bigger history, or a much older history of origin, and they really stem from the time that the United Nations Environment Programme was set up in 1972, when the first World Summit was held on sustainable development. And this happened in Stockholm in 1972, and this was the first time sustainable development as an idea, the idea that the environment was important to protect, that it was that human activity was damaging the environment largely through economic growth, and that the consequences of human action, economic, social, demographic, on the environment needed to be considered and managed. And that was really the start of this movement. And then it went through several ebbs and flows. It went through, I would say, a very strong period of emergence and adoption in Europe and North America in the 70s, when most of the current day environmental regulations that we see in those countries came into effect. Less so in low-income countries, because what also happened in 1972 at the conference was that developing countries made a very strong claim that their primary responsibility to their people was to reduce poverty, and that it was really the responsibility of the wealthier nations to support these countries in managing the environment. And that was really how we came, and that was the tone and the nature of the conversation till we came to the year 1992, when the first Rio Earth Summit was held. And this was the time when the Kyoto Protocol came into force. And there was a fair amount of engagement around environmental issues. But this is also the time, the early 90s, where large economies in developing countries, China, India, many of the Southeast Asian countries, several of the African countries, Latin American countries, were beginning to grow fairly rapidly. And this was not a time where the environment was front and center in terms of attention. And so this continued to be a discussed, understood as important, but not critical issue, where there were other priorities that took precedence. And that really brought us to 2012, where the Rio Plus 20 conference happened. And at this summit, lots of things had changed. First, we'd had the Millennium Development Goals. So there'd been a history of success in terms of both global goal making, but also in terms of collaboration of countries. And then there was the reality of the world in 2012, which is that this is 4 years after the recession of 2008. So there were question marks and a lot of introspection around the nature and the spread of economic growth and what it was doing, not just to particular countries, but around the world. What it was doing to inequality, what it was doing to poverty reduction. At the same time, environmental challenges had now, by this time, become simply too important and too large to ignore. So this is the time where we're beginning to see, after the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the large IPCC studies that brought scientists from all over the world to document the human influence on climate change. We knew by 2012 that global warming was happening at an accelerated pace, and this was happening largely because of greenhouse gas emissions that were largely due to human action. And all the scientific basis for these facts was beginning to have been established in a fairly incontrovertible way. And that really brought us to a point where there was an acknowledgement that growth for its own sake was not enough, that there were issues around whether or not the planet could actually sustain what human activity was doing to it. And that's where the idea of the Sustainable Development Goals was born. And then the UN actually embarked on a 3-year process to design these goals. And what the UN did was to initially convene several groups and bring together people from around the world to identify priorities for the next 15 years. But then it turned that process over to the member states. So this became a matter of political consensus building right from 2014 onwards, where member states got together to decide on what their priorities would be. And that's why we have, by September 2015, what is a fairly unwieldy set of goals, right? So it's a very untidy number. 17 is not a number that you would associate with any formal technocratic process, and that's because it wasn't. This was really a question of countries expressing what was important to them and finding ways of articulating and packaging those priorities into these 17 goals. And if you look at the goals, they basically go through essentially every aspect of human well-being. So they start with poverty reduction, which is really the unfinished agenda of the Millennium Development Goals, which is unlike the Millennium Goals where the goal was to halve poverty, now where the goal is framed very much as ending extreme poverty. So the idea was that this would complete what the MDG process started. Going on to goal 2 on ending hunger, but also looking at what that means in terms of sustainable food production. So not just a question of growing more food to feed people, not just a question of distribution, but a question of how do you actually grow this food? What kind of food do you grow so that you can actually do it in a sustainable manner and preserve some of the other goals that we'll come to. And then, of course, there are goals on health and well-being, which are, again, unlike the Millennium Goals, they are focused on well-being of people of all ages in all countries. The education goal goes way beyond enrollment, which is what the Millennium Goals talked about, into issues of completion, quality of education, training. What is education there for? What sort of adults are we creating when we put our children through 12 to 14 to 16 years of an education system? What is it we want them to become at the end of that? And what sort of skills do we want them to have at the end of that? Goals around gender equality and human rights, very, very important issues that didn't get enough traction earlier. These are also issues where there isn't a uniformity of thinking across countries. So there is variation in how countries deal with these problems. Then to a series of environmental goals around the provision of clean water, the provision of clean energy, preservation of ecosystems, both terrestrial ecosystems and marine ecosystems, and explicitly a goal to combat climate change. So these were really the goals that were there to protect our planet. And then there was a very interesting mix of goals around economic objectives. So for the first time, there's a goal on reducing inequalities. There is, at the same time, there is a goal on spurring economic growth, on innovation, on infrastructure. So we suddenly see now the goals become very complicated in terms of what they're trying to do. There's an explicit goal on cities, which is of course, the focus of the course that you're all enrolled in, which essentially distills these other goals into what they mean for urban areas, because we are now very much an urban world. And finally, a goal around governance and peace and justice, which is, again, a prerequisite for any of the others. And so you might ask the question that what are we doing here? Why do we have so many of these different goals? And I think the way to think about them is that they're, again, an aspiration. They're an articulation of conditions that we consider both necessary but also desirable. So yes, they're aspirational in that these are good things that everybody should want. but they're also necessary, because if we don't aspire towards them, we are hurtling in a direction that is fairly destructive. So to be able to realign us as countries, as individual citizens, but also as residents of a common planet, it's the idea is to put the same framework that would be applicable to everybody. Now, who's done this? This is not some sort of a imposition that's come from the UN or from any extraterrestrial entity. This is really something that member states have thought of themselves. So it is every country in the world that has thought about this. The representatives of those countries through their governments have thought about this and agreed to this framework. So we're all bound to it, bound by it. And the question really, the big challenge now, of course, is implementation. So I want to just touch upon a few issues of implementation that are looming. We're already 3 years into the SDG process. Our goals, our targets are all set for the year 2030, which is not that far away. And when you look at these goals and look at the nature of them, there are 3 types of implementation challenges that are quite significant. The first is the challenge of scale. And the reason I'm saying this is that these are very ambitious goals to achieve in a 15-year framework. If you look at the Millennium Goals, they actually were a 25-year framework, because the baseline year of the Millennium Goals was 1990. So even though they were adopted in the year 2000, progress was benchmarked from the year 1990. That's not the case now. So progress is being benchmarked from 2015, which means we're really talking about a decade and a half in which to achieve some fairly difficult things. So that's the scale problem, is, I would say, the first one. The second problem is that these are not independent goals. So they are, all of them, linked to each other. And I'm sure you've discussed this earlier during the course, but it's pretty clear that you can't think about poverty reduction without thinking of economic growth. You can't think about economic growth without thinking of the effects on inequality. You can't think about planetary improvements without thinking about manufacturing, consumption, production, and so on. So these relationships are fairly tight, and they're fairly well articulated in many ways, which makes them very complicated to implement, because what it does is that it kind of takes away from an implementer the luxury of choice. So you can't just say, okay, I'm just going to focus on SDG 3 and that's it, because very soon you'll realize that SDG 3 actually requires achieving the goal on safe drinking water. And there you are. Once you're there, then you have to start thinking about energy. And so it becomes complex very quickly. The third implementation challenge is around what I call the issues of sovereignty and cooperation. And what does that mean? That basically means that there are several of these goals that can be achieved within a certain jurisdiction. So member states can take on responsibilities for several of these goals and say that we'll do this. But there are several of these goals that actually require action from other countries. And climate change is a classic example of that, where a country that is a very low emitter, let's take the Maldives, which hardly contributes to global warming on its own, is unfortunately going to be affected the first and affected the most severely by rising sea levels. So this is a goal that the Maldives would desperately want to achieve. Unfortunately, the Maldives cannot achieve this goal at all on its own. It can do nothing. It is entirely dependent on actions taken in other countries. And that's true for several of the goals. So that makes these goals particularly complicated to implement. So how do we do it? And I know that we're running out of time. Vinita, how much time do we have?
You're good to go for another two and a half minutes.
All right. So when we're talking about implementation, this is obviously not going to be easy. What it does take is 3 kinds of, I would say, focused activities. The first is really understanding what do the goals mean for me. And that can be interpreted at a national level. It can be implemented at a sub-national level. It can be implemented at a regional level. By regional, I mean globally a regional level. Or it can be implemented at a community level. So there are various sort of levels at which you can think about the goals, but you need, the first thing that needs to happen is an articulation. And I would say the national level is probably the first stage where this needs to happen, is to say, okay, here are the 17 goals. how do they translate into my context, into my reality, into the stage of development that this country is at right now? And of course, the UN has given guidelines on targets and indicators, but this is where a lot of countries will take the targets and indicators that are relevant to them and create a framework that is quite exclusively their own. And that's fine, because that is how you're actually localizing and making these goals meaningful to the reality of the community that's concerned. So that's the first, I would say, area of work. The second area of work is to think about budgeting and planning. Unfortunately, implementation is almost entirely dependent on the resources that we can put together for this work, and that requires very smart planning. And that's really where the maximum effort, I believe, would need to happen in the next couple of years, is to think through what does achievement really look like for these goals. Not an easy task. It's partly an analytical task, but largely a political task of understanding and breaking down what the goals are. Now, remember, the nice thing about goals is they're just goals. They don't in any way tell you how to get there. So there are multiple paths to actually achieving these outcomes. And those need to be determined locally, nationally, with full sovereignty in terms of what are the choices, what are the policy options available, what are the technological options available, what are the social implications of achieving the goals. Once that's done, then the final aspect in terms of implementing is really building the capacity of the implementers. And unlike, again, the Millennium Goals, where most of the goals fell what was clearly into the public domain. So it really was largely state responsibility. Health, education, economic policy making, these are largely the responsibilities of the state. In the case of the Sustainable Development Goals, that's not the case. This is a large part of the goals will be achieved based on what the private sector does, what businesses do, what communities do. And so this is, again, a much more difficult, but I would say a much more exciting challenge that we have ahead of us. So let me stop here and start taking questions.
Thank you, Chandrika. That was very well put. You've basically summarized the entire module in this small talk that you gave us. So we've got a bunch of questions lined up. I'll jump into them. So the first one is from Sukrit from India. Do you feel school curriculum should be including this knowledge about SDGs? And are they, do you know from your experience, if of any cases like that?
Yeah. So first part of that question is yes. I do think I think children should be learning about the Sustainable Development Goals, whether it is in school formally or whether it is through their communities. But children who are in school right now will be the ones that actually live the SDGs in their lifetimes, right? So people who are right now in their teens and in their early adulthood are the ones who will see through the implementation, who will see whether the goals are being achieved or not. Understanding the goals is I think, a first step towards wanting to achieve them. So that's a first step, that we do need to have children think about these issues, because it's part of forming a worldview. And that worldview is premised on certain assumptions. And that's also the worldview that the goals framework is based on, which is, one, we are all part of a global community, and what we do affects everyone. And I think that's a very important principle. It's not always taught in schools, but I think it's absolutely critical in terms of understanding our role in the world. The second is that these goals are universal, which means it doesn't matter if you're in a rich country or a poor country, that the goals are relevant for everyone. Canada just did a very interesting assessment of its progress on the SDGs, and I think it was a shock to many people in the country when they found that they were doing quite badly on several of the goals. And I think that's a really interesting illustration of how universal these challenges are. And then the third principle, I think, of complexity is also very important for children to learn pretty quickly on, because once children grasp the idea of complexity, that things are not always simple, but there are simple goals to aspire to. That's the first step of developing analytical skills that then they could use to solve complex problems. So understanding, appreciating complexity and ambiguity, understanding that there are different perspectives, but that there is a common goal are very, I think, useful life skills in general.
Thank you.
Sorry, just to complete the idea of are there schools actually doing this? Yes, there are. It's the baby steps now, but we've seen a lot of schools now come to us as well, ask for material on the SDGs and figure out ways to teach. So yes, it is happening.
Is this happening on a global scale, or is it just like in India?
I've actually heard of it in several countries, but they're largely individual schools that have decided to take this on. And there are several governments also that have put the SDGs into their national curricula. So this is happening both at a systemic scale, but it's also happening through individual initiative.
Right. So Zalak from Ahmedabad asks, what is the role of an architect in SDG goals, and what is the most important goal or goals that architects or architecture can help in implementation or putting it out there? No, it's very specific, but
it is very specific, but it's a great question, and I think it's also it's exactly the sort of question that I hope everybody in the course asks themselves, which is really relating it to what each one of us is doing. So I would say that on the question of architecture, there is, built space is a huge contributor to global warming, and so figuring out ways in which we can create buildings that are not just contributing less to global warming, but are actually helping reverse the problem, would be a wonderful approach to go. Similarly, I would say think about the course that this webinar is part of, which is thinking of planning of cities in ways that not just minimizes global warming, but also allows for a sustainable use of resources and sustains a much larger demographic of a community, which is the reality of all cities. And we don't have answers to this. We don't actually have examples, particularly, at least not a lot of examples, particularly in countries that are resource constrained, of cities that are designed in ways that maximize opportunities, economic and social opportunities, but also use resources efficiently, that manage waste disposal efficiently, that do not encroach on natural spaces, that contribute back to the environment. We don't have too many examples of this kind. And I do believe that this is doable. It just has not been a priority, and it's not easy to do. So I would say figuring out ways in which both at the city level, so at a larger community level, one can create spaces that are in line with the goals, but also in terms of the materials we use. How do we source these materials? Where do they come from? What are the what is the carbon footprint of construction? How can that be reduced? These are questions that I would say there's a lot of work to do in this area.
Right. So the next question is from Deepika. For lower development countries, how is the government to prioritize among the SDGs, and how are they funded? Can you explain through examples if possible?
Yeah. So, I mean, this is a great question. And again, as I said earlier, this is the nub of the challenge we're facing. I think it's pretty safe to say that countries that fall into the World Bank defined low-income category of countries are not likely to be able to achieve the goals based on their own resources. And that's true for a very simple reason, which is that governments are constrained by their revenues. Their revenues are largely a function of tax collection. Tax to GDP ratios in most low-income countries are fairly low, but also the absolute amounts are fairly low because the GDPs of these countries are not very high. Whereas on the cost side, if you look at what it costs to achieve the SDGs, those costs are much less sensitive to income differentials. There's some differentiation because obviously cost of living is lower. So you would imagine that the cost of educating a child in Sweden would be very different from educating a child in Fiji or in Papua New Guinea. But that differential is much less than actually the differential in the resources that the countries have. So in a sense, the SDGs are fairly expensive for low-income countries relative to their income. And therefore, this is something that has to be, and yet I think the trap that normally forces governments into is prioritization, is to say that because we are resource constrained, we will pick only one or two of these priorities. That to me is would be a tragedy if that happened at scale, because one, it's not practical. There can be emphases which are different in different countries, but to have to choose between for your citizens whether you would rather give your citizens a good education a system or whether you would give them a good health system is it's unnecessary. It's a tragic choice, and there is no good solution to that. So so for that, what is critical is international cooperation. And unfortunately, we don't have a great track record of international cooperation at scale. Having said that, there are lots of success stories, and I want to basically point to two. One is relatively recent and one is fairly old. The relatively recent one is the example of the reduction in child mortality that's happened around the world since the Millennium Goals were adopted. And this has been one of the few really heartening stories, successes in the world. And I would encourage all of you to read up on this, because we do have now a lot of evidence that shows millions of lives saved because basic health systems facilities were made available to mothers and children that didn't have access to them earlier. And that is largely a story of international cooperation. It's largely a story of resources coming from the outside into places where they were needed and being directed and used effectively in a way that allowed for the success to happen. So that's one example. The older example, of course, is one that many of us are familiar with in this part of the world, which is the example of the Green Revolution, which was the first time that developing countries were able to become self-sufficient in food. And that was through both financial but also technology transfers from some of the wealthier countries. And so it is possible, but it is not easy. And to expect low-income countries to achieve the goals on their own would be unrealistic.
Thank you for that. So we have a lot of questions lined up from the chat. So one of them is from Veena Priya Lakshmi, and she would like to know if we know that effective changes can happen only when all citizens from all sections of the society participate in achieving the SDGs. But in low and middle income economies, do urban poor and rural people have the skill sets to understand these SDGs, let alone participating in the change that is required?
Yeah.
So she would like to know.
So I would say absolutely. They may not know. So we have a terminology here, which is the Sustainable Development Goals, which has been adopted by the UN. I'm not sure how widespread that terminology is. But the fact that these goals and the content of these goals is something that matters to people is well known. It's not a function of income. It's not a function of location. In fact, I would argue that the people in the world who have the least resources or the least control over their well-being are the ones who feel most acutely the challenges that are encapsulated in the SDGs. So I don't believe at all that people who live in poverty in rural or urban areas don't understand the goals or cannot articulate their wishes. They can and they do. What they probably don't do is use the language that the international community has adopted, and that's fine. But the issues of adequate and clean water, the issues of energy, access to electricity, the issues of adequate and nutritious food, of health for their children, of education for their children, these are issues they understand well. They understand, they affect this community probably more than any other. And at least in my experience, there is a lot of articulation and commitment to trying to hold their governments accountable.
Right. So we have a specific question from Nairobi. Alex would like to know, is it true that the war on climate change will be won or lost in Africa? Africa is sort of the key or central to this question about climate change and the war on it.
I think Africa is central to a lot of things, actually, not just climate change. Um, there are two parts to this question. One is, unfortunately, the African people have not contributed to global warming. So they are not responsible for climate change. And so, in a sense, all of the actions that need to happen to reduce carbon emissions would need to happen outside of Africa. Um, as the continent develops, as countries on the continent become more economically sophisticated and grow faster, they will, of course, face the choice of how to fuel that growth, and that choice will matter. But so far, Africa has not contributed. Is not a reason for global warming. Unfortunately, what is true is that on the consequence side, Africa will bear much of the consequences of global warming, both in terms of um, increasing desertification, in terms of changing patterns of rainfall, in terms of agricultural productivity, what it will do to livestock. So there is a huge, and because they're going to be very soon, or at least by the time the SDGs are achieved, about 2 billion people that are forecast to be on the continent. This will actually be enormously impactful in terms of what it does to our environment. So whether or not the war is won or lost, the consequences of this battle will definitely be seen on the subcontinent, on the continent, and that is why it's even more important for us to deal with this challenge, because that is the unfairness of the climate change challenge that we have. That there is a completely different set of people that will face the consequences of this than the ones that are causing this problem. I don't know if that answers your question, but it is a reality that we have to manage.
Yeah, I think that was very well answered. So Monique from Kashmir would like to know, we are having a concept of bioaesthetic planning. Can we say it is synonymous to sustainable planning, or are these terms far apart? Only if you're familiar with the concept of bioaesthetic
I'm
planning.
actually not, so I would love to learn more. So you can ask, sorry, who asked that question?
Monique from Kashmir.
So Puneet, if you could send a little bit more information on this, I would love to learn more.
Yeah. Meanwhile, Ambika also has another question. New concepts have emerged, such as business unusual. Are you familiar with business unusual and the relation with SDGs? So she would like to know, in a developmental phenomenon, how much interventions of the local governance in sustainable cities can go in cooperation with the business unusual concept.
So I'm not very familiar with business unusual, though I can guess what this focuses on. I would say that if there's anything that the SDGs require as an essential ingredient for success, it is disruption. And I think that's really the concept behind business unusual, which is that we understand how things have been done in the past across a range of activities, how we make money, for example, how we build our cities, how we build infrastructure, how we source our food. And these have been developed over the last couple of 100 years. So none of these systems are very old. But what we are realizing is that many of them actually are not working for the goals as we've defined the goals. So disruption is going to be an essential ingredient. Now, disruption can take many forms. There is, of course, the notion of technological disruption, and that comes with its own set of both promises but also caveats. And I think technology can do a lot. It can change in many ways how we think about some very fundamental aspects of service delivery, of human interaction, of costs of doing business. But it can also create new challenges, new unforeseen challenges that would need to be managed. So that's kind of one kind of disruption. Then there is organizational disruption, which is how we think about how organizations are created. So, who owns businesses? Who profits from businesses? How does that money flow? And can that be changed? And what would it take to alter those very fundamental power structures that exist in society, both in a commercial sense, but also in a social sense. Who has ownership over our natural resources? How do we design a fairer system of ownership? These are all disruptive questions that if that need to be asked. And again, I don't think there are as yet um, indisputably proven answers to many of these questions. But these are exactly the right questions to ask.
Yeah, it makes sense to bring in all these different corporations and sectors and see how different fields and interdisciplinary sort of progresses can actually help us in achieving these goals. So, on that note, Yefatu would like to know, would it make sense to have a global pot for SDG achievement for those countries that cannot achieve specific goals using their own resources?
Yeah, so this is again, it's something that's been discussed quite extensively, and this is the idea of pooled funds, global funds of some kind. We already have one, which is the Global Fund, which was initially set up as the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria. And this fund has actually had enormous success in tackling HIV/AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis around the world. And the way it operates is that there is a central fund that donors contribute to, but then there is a fairly rigorous, both technical but also community-led process to identify what are the best practice protocols based on which allocations will be made. So we have an example of this. It's obviously, again, not very easy to do, but it's also not that difficult. It's been done, so we know it can be. What essentially has happened is that we've seen that there is one barrier to global funds, which is the lack of or the giving up of control of donors. So if you're going to put money, if I'm a wealthy donor, if I'm one of the wealthy countries and I have funds to contribute, I would typically want to not cede control over where that money goes and how it's spent, right? So for a global fund to work, two things have to happen. One is that donors have to be willing to cede control. And the second is that the recipients have to demonstrate not just good intent, but prudent use of funds and accountability. And only when those two pieces come together do you have an effective mechanism. So the Global Fund's been able to do that. Some other pooled mechanisms of funding have struggled with either one of these two challenges of making sure that there is enough control ceded, but also making sure that there's a way of tracking the money and how it's being used.
Chitesri would like to know, of the 17 goals, which SDG do you think needs to be prioritized? Would focusing on a few of them accelerate the progress on achieving the other ones?
Again, that's an individual decision that countries need to make, because the reality of different countries is different. You will not find me picking one over the others, because as somebody who has worked on all of them and studied very closely how they came about, I can tell you that it's almost impossible to say in the abstract that one is more important than the other. I do believe, though, that depending on national circumstances, countries may have a particular situation where a few of those goals are much more important than others. And the most obvious example is landlocked countries don't need to worry so much about the goal on oceans. And that's the simplest, I would say, example of this. But in more complex ways, every country has a set of priorities that will naturally elevate some goals over the others. And I think that's a decision that's best done through a national dialogue.
Right. So speaking at a national level, Diego has a question. How would you define good governance at all scales? Is it based on good prioritization of partnerships or prioritization of goals? We've gone through so many governments so far. We've seen no change, no reduction in pollution levels, not much change in terms of equity and social issues. Could you please give an example of a country where good governance brought about some good change?
So I would say that, again, good governance is not something that you can isolate in itself. Countries don't magically either have good governance or don't. Institutions are built gradually. They're built over time. Lots of factors contribute to building a state that is strong enough and capable enough to deliver on good governance. And there are very real challenges that prevent governments from doing so. I would also say that some of the goals contribute to good governance. So I would say that if you think about a country that has a fairly well-educated population or a highly skilled population, a healthy population, you are likely to see better governance. And this is in development, this is a very old debate of what comes first. And many of the more, I would say, superficial treatments of the subject would say that countries cannot achieve goals without good governance. And I think that's a very unsatisfying way to look at it, because what governance essentially is the ability of different actors in a state, whether it is the elected representatives, whether it is the appointed bureaucrats, whether it is the community leaders or the informal leaders within the country, the religious and the community traditional leaders, and the general population, to basically agree on a set of rules that are meant to deliver a certain outcome. And when everybody agrees on the rules as well as on the outcome, that's when you can start talking about good governance. Because then, and of course, that has to operate in an atmosphere of trust, mutual trust. Where that trust is broken, or where the rules are designed to fulfill a goal that is not the goal that is articulated, or that is not a goal that is shared by the entire country, that's when you start seeing what we refer to as bad governance, right? Which is, so corruption is a great example of that, where the articulated goal is, say, delivery of a certain outcome. The unarticulated goal is enrichment of a small section of that population. And that divergence is what leads to practices that are not the practices agreed upon by all segments of society. And that's where we see a lot of these challenges come in. There are, of course, many examples of countries that have seen very good governance, but that good governance is almost impossible to extricate from the actual environment that these countries or these institutions are in. So again, I'm not particularly interested in naming names, but I was reading just the other day a very heartening story of the cleanup of Mount Everest, right, which over the last several years, because of the influx of climbers and the interest in doing that climb, had led to an enormous collection of garbage, which was causing real environmental damage on the mountain. And in the last few years, the government of Nepal, together with the Sherpa community that lives around the mountains, have done what seems to be an incredibly impressive job of cleaning up the mountain. Now, that's an example. It's not a national example, but it's an example of where you can see a country that's very poor, that's very resource constrained, but because there's a common goal, which is that, and everybody's interests have aligned on that goal, which is that if the Everest is no longer clean and pleasant and attractive as a destination, the country will lose out on tourism, people will lose out on livelihoods, and it is an environmental disaster along with that. When these goals have come together, you've seen a country with very, what is considered very low capacity, clearly resource constrained, being able to design and implement a policy and a program that has had the effects that it set out to. So this example is fresh on my mind because I've just read about it, but there are several examples of these kinds where you can see that when incentives align, there is a shift towards good governance, but that incentive alignment is very important. And sometimes where the goals may not work is where there is internally there is no alignment in that country on the goals and how to actually translate that into their day-to-day work.
Right. We have more questions on governing sustainable development. Ankita would like to know, interest in the sustainable city is growing around the world, and with it come more important questions about governing sustainable urban development. Why are there blockages in achieving the goal of a sustainable city? and how is it possible to overcome the practical difficulties that initiatives often have to face?
So I would say the number one challenge in the notion of sustainable cities, and again, this is something that the course is all about. So you will be hearing a lot of this in the coming modules as well. I think one of the biggest challenges is designing an institutional frame that both that is able to do two things. It's able to take the goal of a sustainable city and break that down into what it means for different parts of the city for that to work. So, what does it mean for the transportation system? What does it mean for the water and sanitation system? What does it mean for the town planning division of the administration to manage? But then also finding an institutional framework where each of these actors can talk to each other. That doesn't happen very often. And there will always be vested interests that will try and block that for many reasons. Sometimes it's not even vested interest. Sometimes it's just policy inertia, right? There is a certain way that things have been done, and there isn't enough of an understanding of why that needs to change or how that needs to change. So I would say the political economy around a city is critical. Part of that is citizen demand. So when citizens demand more, typically the administration responds, because the nice thing about cities is the density, which means that the service provider or the decision maker is actually very close to the end user, which is not the case in rural areas, where there's a big gap between where the decisions are made and where they're implemented. There's also less variation within a closed geographic framework. So again, it's easier to implement a policy at scale in a city, which may be much harder to do at a regional or a national level. So when there is this alignment there's a clear articulation of the goals and what they mean practically, when there is citizen engagement to actually make that difference, and when that difference can be visibly felt, which it can in cities, those blockages can then be addressed. But it's not easy, because a lot of cities, particularly the ones that have been around for a while, are set in patterns of both geographic distribution but also governance systems that are very hard to change. And that's why, again, I keep coming back to the fact that it's important to know the goals. It's important to understand them. It's important to advocate for them, because that's when there is a large enough community that talks about these issues, that's when change will start.
Hi, Chandrika, you're right. And we've had so many questions so far asking about implementation challenges. And clearly that is like one of the most draining thought processes that are going on among our students also, about why, if there are so many goals and initiatives, why are there problems in like implementation? So how to get over it? So on that note, Veenu Lakshmi would like to know, with governments driving economic growth, which in turn drives more inequality, how and where the governments can find balance between what is required for economic growth to run the country and how to balance the inequality that comes with it.
So I would say that, over the last half a decade, I would say there's been a very heartening development, which is that this automatic linkage is being questioned and actually broken, at least in thinking about this issue. So there is absolutely no reason why economic growth should naturally lead to more inequality, unless the growth has certain characteristics, which is that it is limited to a very small number of sectors of the economy, that it is limited to a very small social or economic segment of society, and if there is no mechanism to either broaden that growth or to transfer the gains of economic growth to other members of society. So there is now a lot of literature, both in economics, also in political science, that is actually talking about these issues. We also have examples of countries that have chosen a different path. And in fact, I want to mention the example of the state of Sikkim in India, which made a decision several years ago to follow an economic strategy of green growth. And that's showing results now in terms of the environment. It's showing results now in terms of inequality. And this goes back to the very well established and I would say best articulated position on this, which is Amartya Sen's concept of capabilities. That when, in terms of policy, when we focus on human capabilities, what we're essentially doing is broadening the base of the participants, of the effective participants in a growth process. And so that's, I would say, the first step, which is the capabilities argument. The second argument is, of course, the ownership argument. Who owns wealth? Who owns capital? How do we define that? And how do we control and manage that? And that's, again, something which was questioned very much after the 2008 recession. Unfortunately, that is very, very hard to change. And we're seeing that now. If you look at, Oxfam brings out a report every year where it looks at global inequality, and it's unfortunately getting worse. It's getting worse because we know that people that are extremely wealthy, what we call the ultra high net worth individuals in the world, there are about 2,000 of them, as defined in that way, and their wealth is now larger than it's ever been before. So this is a difficult problem to tackle, but I would break that first assumption of the fact that growth automatically leads to inequality. It does not automatically lead to inequality. It leads to inequality when policy choices are made that enable that. So this should not be, the consequence of this should not be an anti-growth strategy, because that's not, we do have a very, very large number of people living in extreme poverty around the world even now. And greater resources, greater access to facilities is the only way we can improve well-being for everyone. So I would not make this about a problem with economic growth, but really how we think about that growth and how we design it.
So we're almost towards the end of our webinar. We'll be taking the final few questions. So Ambika would like to know, what could be the interventions for catalyzing green finances to achieve sustainable cities in LDCs like Nepal?
So there are actually now some very interesting examples that we have of green financing. There are bonds there are new instruments of financing that have emerged which focus on compensations for investments in sustainability. There are also ecosystem services that are now being priced out, and the pricing of those services is leading to new financial instruments, which can then be used to generate growth. So there is a lot of work in this area. It's an exciting field. And so if you're interested, I would strongly urge you to look at some of this literature, because there are examples that can be used. Nepal actually is a great example of a country that has a disproportionate wealth in terms of its what it gives to the world in terms of ecosystem services. It essentially cradles all of the Himalayan wealth, which translates both into biosphere reserves, but also in terms of water. And so finding a way to compensate the country and finding a way to price that ecosystem so that that can be preserved is actually a very interesting area of work. And I'm not aware right now of anyone that's actually done it, but it's definitely worth doing. And I know of some conversations that have started in this regard.
Right. Our final question for today will be from Krishna Kumar. Is it possible that cities don't have any independent governance? Like New York City has a city head, but then Chennai in India will always be ruled by the ruling party of the state. So your thoughts on that?
So again, I don't want to talk about particular examples because there is such a wide diversity of ownership, administration, power control, and the correlation with what happens in the cities is mixed. I mean, it's not a clear picture. I do think accountability is important. So there have to be mechanisms where the people who make decisions on behalf of citizens are accountable to them. That could be through a mayor with actual effective executive powers. It could be through a mechanism of the regional government or the state government. But the accountability needs to be defined very clearly. And that's another area where the goals are really interesting because they can provide a framework for uh, creating that accountability, which otherwise may be quite diffused and difficult to understand. In general, I think as cities grow, the notion of independent governance for them will become more important simply because of the management aspect of it. Many of the cities, the mega cities in Asia and Latin America and Africa are larger than entire populations of countries. And so being able to govern them would require that kind of capacity and that kind of dedication. So that I think is an inevitable trend. But again, as I said, policy inertia is very strong, and so many of these structural changes take time to get implemented.
Right. A final quick question from Peter. How is it possible to put our knowledge from this study into practice in a country that has no political will to implement the SDGs even after signing the Paris Agreement?
That's a great question. And I would say the first step in this is mobilize people around you. I do think that unfortunately, the reality, I think, of at least the politics of today is that our political leaders follow rather than lead. So political leaders, and I have seen this time and again, change their position based on what their voters and their constituents ask them to do. So there is no alternative to creating and spreading an understanding of these issues, to generating healthy dialogue and debate, and to engaging with people that disagree with you or that don't think that these issues are important. Because I've yet to come away from a real discussion and dialogue where both parties don't change their position just a little bit. So I would say that spread awareness. These courses like the Sustainable Cities course are a great way to do that because in a very short amount of time, there is exposure to a very wide range of issues and perspectives. And I think it's very important to actually hear things that are unfamiliar or that are new or that are different from the world that we live in on a day-to-day basis. And then using that knowledge to both generate interest and conversation, but also action is absolutely essential. So I would say there's no substitute for citizen action and engagement. And I would encourage everybody who's listening here to arm themselves with as much knowledge as they need to make their case effectively. And if you disagree, write and engage with the faculty of this course and other courses, so that there is actually a rich discussion around these issues, and hopefully that will lead to action. In fact, I'm fairly certain it will. But that's the only way, because sometimes, again, there are entrenched interests and political will. It's not cast in stone, it changes. And so it is really our job as citizens and voters to change that will.
Great. Thank you so much, Chandrika. This is great. And with this, we will wrap up this webinar. Thank you so much for tuning in, everybody, and thank you for your engaging questions. If you have any further questions, as Chandrika says, please, we encourage you to post on the discussion forum. Start a dialogue with your peers, start a dialogue with us. You can also write to us at cities@sdgacademy.org for any clarifications on the module or anything. You can find the recording of this webinar under the weekly webinar tab. And the date for the next webinar is 13th of June with Aroma Revi. So please guys tune in again. And thank you again for your active participation. We will see you again next week. Good night. Thank you, Chandrika. See you soon.
Bye.
Bye.